I'm Mike Perry. I'm the president of the Army Heritage Center Foundation. The foundation serves as a friends group for the U.S. Army Heritage Education Center, the Army's premier archival facility dedicated to telling the Army's story one soldier at a time. Please come visit if you've not been here. We're open to the public and we are free. Tonight, we're going to take a different tact. Typically, we do real history. Tonight, we're going to talk about how to take real history and turn it into effective fiction. We're pleased to have Michael Gibson here tonight to talk on this topic. Michael received his BA with special distinction in history in 1972 from the University of Oklahoma, where he was selected Phi Beta Kappa. He also then received his JD there in 1975. He then left the state for stints in private law practice and with the federal government until he was appointed in 2008 to his current position as a federal administrative judge. He is the author of 2 World War II novels, The Broomcorn Field and Leaving Pontotoc Country. He has begun research on his 3rd novel, Can We Find Our Way Back Home? He will answer questions at the end of his presentation. Mike, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Mike. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, great. I'm Michael Gibson. As Mike just said, I'm going to talk this evening about the importance of writing historically accurate World War II fiction. Before we begin, I want to tell you what a genuine honor it is to be with you tonight. And I especially want to thank Mike Perry and the Army Heritage Center Foundation for sponsoring this Zoom book talk and for making it possible for us to be together. This is how we're going to proceed. I'm going to share with you how I came to be a World War II novelist, how I structured my novels, and why I chose the time and the place in which they're set. After that, we'll talk about the action of my novels, with primary emphasis on one of them, the Broomcorn Field. Then we'll conclude with what compelled me to write these novels and why it is so critically important that we write historically accurate accounts of World War II. My total presentation PowerPoint should be about 50 minutes. But as we get started, I would ask that you please keep a notepad or the back of an envelope handy so that you can jot down any questions or concerns that you have as we go along, because as Mike indicated, at the end of this, we'll have a time for questions and answers. And that is really important because the purpose of this hour is not about me. Rather, it is about helping you establish a connection to World War II, which was the single most significant event of the modern age, if not of all human history. So let's begin with how this stranger who's appearing before you tonight became a novelist. And I would ask that you please bear with me if I appear to be taking you down a rabbit trail of seemingly irrelevant background material that has absolutely nothing to do with World War II or Army Rangers or writing fiction. I promise I really will tie all of these strands together before we finish tonight. I grew up in Norman, Oklahoma, and I suspect that when most of you hear Norman, Oklahoma, you think of the Palace on the Prairie, the home of a very famous college football team that won 7 national championships between 1950 and 2000. And although it hasn't won a national championship since 2000, it has still won more football games than any other college team in the country in the last 20 years. Certainly, the University of Oklahoma's most illustrious president was George Lynn Cross. He was presided there for several decades, beginning in World War II when my novels are set, and he went all the way through to 1968 when I started college there. President Cross actually penned a book entitled Presidents Can't Punt. And in it, he quipped, "We're working hard to develop a university that the football team can be proud of." Like the flagship university in every other state, though, OU has never been able to translate its success on the gridiron into the kind of across-the-board excellence in academics that would place it in U.S. News and World Report's top 10 best universities. But despite this, there definitely are some places in which OU has achieved some remarkable achievements, and I'm only going to share 4 of them with you, and even those I'm going to share only briefly. First, OU's women's softball team just won the College World Series, which makes their 6th national championship, and at this rate, they're on course to eclipse OU's football team for athletic achievements. Secondly, Oklahoma has completely insane weather. Think tornadoes and floods of biblical proportions. This misfortune, though, has given birth to a world-class meteorology school. And so if you have a child or a grandchild who wants to be a meteorologist, they definitely need to consider going to OU. Third, Oklahoma is blessed with copious quantities of oil and natural gas. In fact, when Oklahoma was admitted to statehood in 1907, it was producing more barrels of crude oil than any other state in the country. That in turn has attracted scholars from all over the globe to study petroleum engineering, land management, and geology. Finally, through a series of truly horrific events for Native Americans, Oklahoma became the dumping ground for the tribes who were displaced by white settlers in the East. As a result of this trail of tears that ended in Oklahoma, the University of Oklahoma consistently leads the country in the field of Native American history. And that leads us to this man, my father, Errol Morgan Gibson. He served as chair of OU's history department for many years, and he wrote over 20 full-length books. I couldn't get all of them on the shelf, but that gives you some idea. And you'll note that a lot of those book titles concern this incredibly sad chapter of Native American history. One of them in particular, the Chickasaws, finished second in the balloting for the Pulitzer Prize in History in 1971. And that is a big part of how I came to be before you tonight. As I was growing up in the shadow of my father, writing history books just seemed like what you should do with your life. So when I entered the University of Oklahoma in 1968, I chose history as my major. And I wasn't able to take classes from my father, of course, but I did pretty well. And things were rocking along until the winter of my junior year, which was 1971. And my father sat me down and he told me that I could not become an historian. Well, I was gobsmacked. But I began to recover as I heard his rationale, which for my father was typically flawless. And he explained that the birth rate for the baby boom generation was in steep decline, and there was a massive glut in the PhD market. Essentially, there were lots of history PhDs, but there were scarcely any students for them to teach. As a result of that, although my father told me he was turning out the best PhDs he had ever had, he was having a terrible time placing them in anything more elevated than teaching high school history or being a public school librarian. Well, at that point, I lacked the business acumen for an MBA. I think the closest that I ever got to the business school was economic history of the United States. And I lacked both the science courses and the aptitude that would be necessary to become a physician or a veterinarian. And as a result of that, the only profession that was readily open to me at that point was law. So I toiled away for 3 years in OU's law school. And for the next 33 years, I was a trial lawyer. And now for the last 14, I've served as a judge here in DC. Okay, now let's shift gears for just a minute. And I want you to think back on whatever you can remember about the Renaissance. And I suspect that one of the first things that will come to your mind is one of its central figures, the 14th century humanist Petrarch. Like my personal hero, who was Voltaire, who came along 4 centuries after Petrarch, both Petrarch and Voltaire tried law, but eventually they turned instead to literature. Petrarch explained his decision in this way: I couldn't face making a merchandise of my mind. Now, I would never go as far as Petrarch in criticizing my chosen profession, but it is true that literature and history kept whispering into my ear through the years that there had to be something more. And with time, those whispers became shouts. Now, I should disclose to you at this point that I actually did publish a book 30 years ago, and I gave it the catchy title, Environmental Regulation of Petroleum Spills and Wastes. My understanding is to this day, it remains at the top of the bestseller list for Insomniacs Anonymous. But suffice it to say that writing this book scarcely satisfied my long-held desire to get back to history. Instead, it just made the itch I couldn't scratch all the more maddening. Fortunately, shortly after I received my appointment as a judge, my wife and I became empty nesters. And so, for the next 11, actually 12 years now, even though I kept my day job as a judge, and I should add to my wife's great chagrin, I began devoting all of my nights and all of my weekends to researching anything and everything that I could lay my hands on about 2 World War II topics that completely captivated me. The first of these topics was the First Ranger Battalion, which I maintain was the most elite fighting force of World War II. Now, even if you've never heard of the First Ranger Battalion, you may at least recognize this man. He also grew up in Norman, Oklahoma, and he also attended the University of Oklahoma before he served in the Korean War. And if you can't guess who that is, perhaps you'll recognize him as the star of the 1958 movie Darby's Rangers. Yes, that is James Garner, at the age of 18, who played William O. Darby, the man who headed up the First Ranger Battalion during its entire existence. Now, I can share with you a bit of movie trivia about James Garner that you can use to wow your friends if you'd like. His actual name was shortened when he went to Hollywood from the name on his birth certificate, which is Bumgarner. And the reason that I know that is because his brother was my junior high school principal. Anyway, the First Ranger Battalion is the subject of one of my books, The Broomcorn Field. The second thing about World War II that completely captivated me was the dramatic change that the war brought to American society and culture, especially the changing roles of women and African Americans. And that is the central theme of my other novel, Leaving Pontotoc County. However, for tonight, we're going to focus almost exclusively on the Broomcorn Field. Now, I don't know about you, but as a writer of historical fiction, I read some as well. And in the course of reading others' historical fiction, I have developed some pet peeves that I want to share with you about historical fiction. One of them is when an author makes something up that could never have plausibly happened during the time or in the place where the novel is set. To make sure that I did not make this mistake, I went to great lengths to check and recheck my facts to try to ensure that they're completely correct. So far, no one has found a mistake, but if you do, I should add, I had some wonderful proofreaders who made sure I didn't. But if you do, please don't hesitate to bring it to my attention because it is very important to me that I get this right. The second thing that drives me crazy is when an author fails to give the reader adequate context for the events of the novel. Now, this is especially important when writing about World War II. Think about it. World War II had 2 theaters, the Pacific and the European. But as well, it had 3 separate sub-theaters within each of these. In the Pacific, we had one sub-theater, which was the Asian mainland. The second sub-theater was the American and Australian troops under General MacArthur, who were in the Southwest Pacific and were moving toward the Philippines. And the third sub-theater in the Pacific Theater was under the leadership of Admiral Nimitz, where combined Navy, Marine, and Army troops were pushing through the rest of the Pacific toward Japan itself. In the European theater, we had the Eastern Front, where the Soviets and the Nazis duked it out for 4 years. We had the Western Front, where although the Nazis had largely subdued it in 1940, was still the subject of tremendous resistance activity, a lot of Allied bombing, and of course, that is where the Allies made their famous D-Day landings at Normandy in 1944. And the third sub-theater is the Mediterranean Front, which includes Southern Europe, the Middle East, the Mediterranean Sea, and Africa. And I should add, most of the military action in both of my novels actually takes place in the Mediterranean theater. In addition to the 6 distinct multiple venues where events were occurring in each of them at literally breakneck speed, there was also a wholesale shift going on in America during this time. Simply put, to win the war, the United States was going to have to transform itself into a modern industrial state. There is one fact that for me best encapsulates this, and that is when the war began, the United States had the 17th largest army in the world, right behind the 16th largest army in the world, which belonged to Romania. And yet, by the end of the war, the United States had become the undisputed most powerful nation on earth. Now, what greatly complicates explaining these developments is the simple fact that the further and further away we get from World War II, the less and less anyone knows about it. Practically everybody who fought in World War II, along with their spouses, boyfriends, girlfriends, mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, cousins, are all dead. And essentially, we have no one left with firsthand knowledge of the war. But in addition to that, few of the children or the grandchildren or the great-grandchildren of those who fought World War II know very much about it. And I think part of their ignorance is exactly the way that the greatest generation wanted it to be. They had suffered greatly during the Great Depression and World War II, and they did not want to subject us to their pain. But another part of our ignorance, I think, comes from the natural aversion that we all have to thinking about war, largely because it involves military stuff and premature death. And those are things we just don't want to dirty our hands with because they're so unpleasant and crude. Now, I totally get that. Very few folks are anxious to sink their teeth into a comprehensive 800-page nonfiction treatise on the details of all the battles that were fought in World War II. Although I should tell you that I've actually read a lot of those 800-page treatises because I wanted to make sure I understood what happened so that I could tell both of my stories accurately to my readers. But here is the problem if you don't know about World War II. It is impossible to understand America's transformation into a modern industrial state with all of the manifold problems that we face today unless you learn certain key facts about what was going on both overseas and stateside during those 4 years. So here was my dilemma. I felt I just had to give my readers the historical context in which the action of my novels took place, but there was no ready-made format for doing that. And then in the midst of my struggle over this, a gift arrived to me from the ancient Greeks. Maybe it happened in a dream, I can't really say, although I can tell you that my gift from the ancient Greeks was not a Trojan horse. Instead, it involved Greek theater. Now, think back to the Greek theatrical productions that you've seen or read, like Sophocles' tragedy Oedipus Rex or Aristophanes' comedy Lysistrata. In practically all Greek plays, there's a chorus that comes out before the action begins to explain to the audience, often in very snarky terms, I should add, what they're about to see. And then after each act of the play, the chorus comes back out and they talk to the audience about what they've just seen, what has been occurring off stage as the action unfolded, and they explain to them what they're about to see next. And then at the end of the play, the chorus explains to the audience the significance of what they just beheld on stage. These Greek theatrical devices have names. They are the parados, the stasimon, and the exode. The parados is that initial appearance of the Greek chorus. The stasimon are those addresses that they give between episodes of the play. And the exode is that last choral address that they give as the play ends. So with this gift in hand from the ancient Greeks, I created a series of compressed histories explaining the key events that transpired in each of these sub-theaters as each of my novels began, as well as during discrete moments of the war. And then I dropped each of those compressed histories into my novels, just as was done by the chorus in Greek plays. These Greek theatrical devices enabled me to show my readers what was transpiring elsewhere on the globe as the action of the novel begins, the parados, what was transpiring elsewhere as each episode is about to begin, the stasimons, and what the war should signify for us as the narrative closes, the exode. Both of my novels have a parados, both have an exode. The Broomcorn Field has 11 stasimons, and Leaving Pontotoc County has a few more than that. I found these to be ideal literary devices for conveying the interconnectedness among the protagonists, the conditions that led America into the war, and the challenges that the greatest generation faced in its odyssey to win the war. So, now that we've talked about how I structured my novels to give my readers the historical context for the narrative, I want to share with you why it was that I picked their setting. I hope you caught Lin-Manuel Miranda's recent film, Tick, Tick, Boom, about Jonathan Larson, the musical theater genius who was played in this film by Andrew Garfield, pictured there on the right. Jonathan Larson, of course, wrote the musical theater masterpiece Rent, which ran for 12 consecutive years on Broadway. Now, Miranda has made a wonderful movie in its own right, and if you haven't seen it, I strongly encourage you to do so. But for our purposes tonight, I want to call your attention to just one particular moment in that film that involves the late Stephen Sondheim. Sondheim had just seen the first run-through of a play that Larson was writing, a futuristic play he was writing called Superbia. After he saw it, Sondheim called Larson and left a message on his answering machine, and this is what he said: "Jonathan, you might consider writing less about a future in outer space with robots and focus instead on the life that you're living right now in New York City." Sondheim's advice, of course, led Larson to compose Rent. But Sondheim's advice also reflects the cardinal rule of fiction, and that is that you should only write about what you know. In my case, I spent 25 years of my life in Oklahoma, and I spent the next 33 in the adjacent state of Texas. So that is something I know well. Consequently, my characters were born and raised in parts of Oklahoma, and their dialogue with each other reflects that part of the world during World War II. But for the last 14 years, I've lived in Maryland, and I can say without qualification that Americans carry around with them certain universal concerns that transcend any particular part of the country. We are all worried about war and peace. We are all worried about love and death. We are all worried about marriage and raising kids. And we are all worried about the legacy that we will leave behind us when we're no longer around. In fact, it was many of these same universal concerns about the human condition that led Homer to create the Iliad and the Odyssey 3,000 years ago. Likewise, William Faulkner set his novels in pre-World War II Mississippi, which, like pre-World War II Oklahoma, is about as far as you can get from the Trojan War. And yet Faulkner's novels address the same universal questions that Homer did. My point is that you, as a reader, should not be put off by the fact that characters are born and raised in a place unlike America in 2022, whether it's ancient Greece, pre-World War II Mississippi, or pre-World War II Oklahoma. In many ways, in fact, it was in Oklahoma where some of the most dramatic changes were wrought during World War II. To demonstrate this, let's think about what America was like in 1940. It was racist. It was misogynist. It was parochial. Nearly half of Americans lived in rural areas when the war broke out. And then there's illiteracy. This is a really cool chart showing educational attainment between 1940 and 2009. We're in a hurry, so we can only focus on the bar that has to do with 1940, which is on the far left. You will note that 6% of the people in the United States had a college degree in 1940. 7% did not have a college degree, but at least had some college. 22% had no college, but had a high school diploma. And that left 64% of the people in the United States in 1940 who did not have a high school diploma. Oklahoma was even more racist, more misogynist, more parochial, more rural, and its illiteracy rate was even higher than the rest of the country as a whole. So in many ways, pre-World War II Oklahoma was the ideal place to set my novels, because not only is that what I know, but the state can serve as the ideal canary in the coal mine for whether modernity could even take hold in America. Or, to paraphrase Frank Sinatra, if it could happen there, it could happen anywhere. So let's turn to my novels themselves, and then we can turn to why I wrote them and why it is so important that we write historically accurate fiction about World War II. The Broomcorn Field involves one hero, Virgil Davis, who is a high school senior in the lead to be valedictorian of his high school class, when he is faced suddenly with a series of tragedies that culminate with the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. Virgil never gets to be class valedictorian because he instead enlists in the Army, and he is selected for the First Ranger Battalion. Now, along the way, Virgil befriends two other young men. One is a farm boy who grew up in southeast South Dakota, and the second could best be described as an urban hipster circa 1942 from an Italian enclave called Peterstown in Elizabeth, New Jersey. Virgil also becomes close to an English chaplain and eventually to a pretty girl whom he meets only once at a train depot. And that train depot is right here in North Platte, Nebraska. And I want to give a shout out to a wonderful book about this train depot called Once Upon a Town. It explains that all of the troop trains in the middle of the United States going north or south ended up in North Platte, Nebraska. From there, 18, 19, 20-year-old boys, many of whom had never even been off the farm and were absolutely scared out of their minds, were going to switch trains and either head east to fight the Nazis and the fascists or head west to fight the Japanese. The residents of the city of North Platte operated a canteen at this train depot for the entire duration of the war, around the clock, to meet every single boy as he made this brief connection. And they provided him with a sandwich, a cookie, a cup of coffee, a smile, and words of encouragement. Now, while Virgil is there, he happens to meet a high school girl who is handing out popcorn balls to the troops who passed through the depot that day. The two of them spend all of 2 minutes together, but they end up corresponding with each other throughout the war, and they grow close in the process. Now, I noted earlier that I think the First Ranger Battalion was probably the most elite fighting force of World War II. And frankly, it is hard to understate just how elite it was. U.S. Army regular soldiers who were training in Northern Ireland with their units were invited to try out for Ranger service in a barren wilderness in Northern Ireland called Carrickfergus. During this intensive training regime in 1942, most of the soldiers who tried out failed to make the cut, and they were RTU'd, which means returned to unit. Hundreds more were invited to try out, and most of them were RTU'd as well. After culling and culling and culling and culling until he had the absolute most elite of the absolute most elite candidates, Major William O. Darby finally had a critical mass of commandos. And at that point, all enlisted men and officers, even Major Darby himself, were put through an even more rigorous training regime in Scotland at the Royal Commando School in Achnacarry. After that challenge, the Rangers were turned over to the Royal Navy, who trained them in how to conduct amphibious landings in the painfully frigid waters of Kintra Bay in Scotland. Finally, the Rangers trained in Dundee, where they learned urban warfare. Now, while most of the Rangers were training at Kintra Bay, a very few of them were assigned to participate in what turned out to be a colossal disaster at Dieppe, France. It was an amphibious landing that went awry, and it was such a disaster for the Canadian, English, and American troops involved that the Allies would not try another landing in France until the Normandy landing 2 years later. But the Rangers did make a successful amphibious landing in Africa as part of Operation Torch. They disabled 2 military installations in Arzou, Algeria, that guarded the harbor there. And by doing that, they cleared the way for the 1st Infantry Division to steam into Arzou and take the area from Nazi sympathizing Vichy French. Shortly after that landing, the Rangers were also involved in a major urban battle with the French at St. Cloud. Then in 1943, the Rangers moved from Algeria to Tunisia, where they defeated Italians at Station de Sened, as well as at El Guitar, which was one of the truly epic achievements of World War II. The Rangers came up the backside of a mountain that was held by Italians, and they were completely undetected. They were also completely outnumbered, but they still overwhelmed the Italians, got them all to surrender, and enabled the 1st Infantry Division to go forward in attacking the Axis forces. After that, the Rangers made yet another amphibious landing as part of Operation Husky that captured Sicily. It was at this point that the Rangers began to run into a series of obstacles. Before Sicily, they had been operating as just one battalion. But beginning with Operation Husky, the Rangers had to be broken up into 3 battalions, and they took on a whole lot of new recruits, very few of whom could have met the high standards that had been set for the Rangers when they were first formed. And then those 3 battalions were often parceled out to assist with other military units, which prevented the Rangers from operating as just one group. And I should add that in these landings at Sicily, that is where my father, A.M. Gibson, was injured on a ship by German bombs. And instead of playing catcher for the New York Yankees between Bill Dickey and Yogi Berra, he ended up becoming a college professor. Anyway, the Rangers were also placed under the command of General Mark Clark, who seemed not to appreciate the special mission that the Rangers had played in Africa and Sicily. The Rangers were frankly misused horribly in combat on the Italian mainland, at both the Operation Avalanche landings at Salerno and on the Winter Line in the mountains of Italy in combat that is almost like World War I. The Rangers came to see General Clark as not only wasting the offensive expertise that they had, but as well as treating them as nothing but just grunt infantry in close combat with the Nazis, who were led by an absolute genius, the General Kesselring. You know, people talk about Hans Guderian or Rommel or several of the others. This guy was a genius as defensive skills. Anyway, so in 1944, the Rangers were cast as the central players in Operation Shingle, which was an imaginative surprise attack against the Nazis behind enemy lines at the resort town of Anzio. Unfortunately, the general immediately under Mark Clark, who was John Lucas, was in charge of that landing, and he failed to advance quickly enough off the beachhead. By the time the Rangers were finally authorized to advance, General Kesselring's troops had already dug in to ambush the Rangers at a village known as Cisterna, a few miles inland from Anzio, and essentially that was the end of the First Ranger Battalion. Now, Cisterna was a tragedy with many fathers. For one thing, the Rangers were not given sufficient time to train their new recruits, and many of them panicked during combat. Secondly, radio silence was imposed on the Rangers, and it created enormous confusion during the battle and prevented the Allied command from giving adequate cover and artillery support to the Rangers' assault. Third, because the Cisterna battle plan had been thrown together in only one day, the Rangers never had a chance to conduct their own confirmatory reconnaissance of the area. And it seems clear that had they been given that opportunity, they almost certainly would have scrapped the plan. But most military scholars lay the bulk of the blame for the Rangers' demise at the feet of General Lucas. And they do that for 2 reasons. First, because Lucas delayed launching a concerted attack on the Nazis until after all Allied forces had landed at Anzio, he essentially gift-wrapped an opening for Kesselring to move 70,000 battle-hardened German troops into the area. In addition to that, there was Allied intelligence to suggest that Kesselring was massing forces outside the beachhead, but Lucas misinterpreted those Nazi troop movements as nothing more than outnumbered German forces digging in against certain obliteration by the Allies. Certainly, the Rangers' courageous stand at Cisterna prevented Kesselring from launching a counterattack against the Allied beachhead at Anzio for several weeks. And that in turn allowed the Allies to muster a sufficient force there to avoid being thrown back into the sea. And ultimately, in fact, the Allies were able to push the Germans all the way to Rome, but it took them until May of 1944. It happened at the same time as the D-Day landings. But the price the Rangers paid was devastating. Of 767 Rangers who were in direct combat in the Battle of Cisterna, only 6 escaped. Everybody else was either killed or captured. Now, all this and more is contained in the Broomcorn Field. But I can't tell you the more because I don't want to spoil your reading, frankly. However, just to whet your appetite, if you haven't yet read the Broomcorn Field, there are 3 other historically accurate subjects that I have folded into the basic story of the First Ranger Battalion to tell Virgil's story. One involves Italian partisans who served as the resistance to the Nazis in northern Italy. The second is America's planning for something about which few of us know anything at all, and that is Operation Coronet, which was the planned full-scale invasion of Japan that, according to the military advisors talking to Truman, many felt that there would have been millions of people killed had that gone forward. It didn't because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I've also folded in some romance. Okay, we're going to talk very briefly about leaving Pontotoc County, but only to note that after graduating from the University of Oklahoma, one of the heroines of this novel was selected for the first class of dietitians to graduate from Walter Reed. This is a picture of Walter Reed during World War II. And she was then commissioned as an officer and went to work on an Army hospital ship and later on the front lines in Nancy, France. And in case you're interested in my novels, you can certainly purchase them through Amazon. Now, I want to turn to what motivated me to write these 2 novels and to offer some additional reasons for why it is so important that we write historically accurate fiction about World War II. The primary reason I wrote these novels is largely literary and personal. In my estimation, we seem to have lost our heroes in the century that followed America's entry into World War I. Yes, I said World War I. Authors ever since then who want to write fiction are hemmed in by modernism's conviction that art is all that matters. Modernism was the predominant literary and philosophical movement during World War I, but it continues to have great weight. Their conviction was that middle-class culture is fundamentally empty and meaningless because it lacks the theatrical, visual, musical, and literary qualities that all good art should have. But today's authors are also hemmed in on the other side by a second literary and philosophical movement, Post-Modernism, which was predominant during World War II and its aftermath. Postmodernism does a lot of things, but in particular, it embraces cultural relativism. And let me say that unlike many of my baby boom counterparts, I love millennials. In fact, 2 of my 3 daughters are millennials. But there is one thing that millennials often say that grates on me like fingernails on a chalkboard, and that is, it's all good. Actually, it's not all good, especially when it comes to World War II. Instead, it is critically important that we make distinctions between the good and the bad, the ugly and the beautiful, the moral and the immoral. Anyway, because of these 2 powerful literary and philosophical movements, most of our heroes have been relegated to being nothing but downright deviant cowards who, even at their best, prove themselves to be shallow and hypocritical. I think you only need to consider how Harper Lee cut Atticus Finch down a notch from To Kill a Mockingbird when she wrote Go Set a Watchman to understand what I'm talking about. Certainly, most literary scholars currently embrace these developments, but it does not resonate with me at all. And I think the chief reason that I feel so strongly about this, especially when it comes to World War II, derives from the fact that the greatest generation suffered from severe trauma. And complicating this is the fact that their trauma was neither diagnosed nor treated. My parents' generation most definitely were heroes, but they never felt like heroes at all. And I think that largely is because they survived. For the men, they came home while their buddies were left behind on the battlefield or at the bottom of the sea. For the women, their husbands and boyfriends and sons came home, but they had relatives and neighbors whose husbands and boyfriends and sons never made it back. And yet it is nearly impossible to convey the pathos of these survivors in a nonfiction work. For my money, the best and perhaps the only way to convey the depth of their suffering is through fiction. I think the best way to demonstrate this is through Richard III, who was King of England for a mere 2 years at the end of the 15th century. Now, if you read any nonfiction account of Richard III, you'll learn that he usurped power, he killed a lot of his relatives in the process, he played a part in the War of the Roses, and he was the last of the Plantagenet kings. But when you put Richard III in the hands of William Shakespeare, you realize what a truly diabolical genius this king was. No offense meant to historians. As I noted earlier, my father was among the best of them. But nonfiction accounts simply cannot capture the sheer depravity of this guy and the intense suffering of everyone who came in contact with him. For this reason, I submit, we need fictional accounts of historical events. For as long as they are otherwise factually accurate, fictional accounts can supply the meaning that we need for appreciating what our psychologist friends like to call the music behind the words. I personally like what was said by the fiction writer Franz Kafka. A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. Writing The Broomcorn Field and leaving Pontotoc County certainly opened up my own frozen sea, and it is my hope that it will open up the frozen sea inside my readers as well. But the second thing that motivated me to write these books is largely social and cultural. Now, I recognize that historical fiction may seem to you like an unlikely vehicle for moving readers toward justice and fairness for the oppressed. But as George Santayana has noted for us, those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. And the lessons of World War II are critically important for us always to keep in mind, whether it be the essential need for an effective collective security agreement among nations to ally themselves against dictators, or the evils that the Nazis perpetrated with the Holocaust, or the Japanese military's capture of 200,000 women and girls to serve as comfort women for their troops, and the countless other atrocities that the Axis countries committed. At the same time, I'm convinced that the values we should most cherish not only were under attack in World War II, but that they're under attack now. Not to be overly dramatic about this, but it's my firm belief that the very legacy of the Enlightenment is at stake in 2022, just as it was 80 years ago when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Freedom, democracy, dissent, tolerance, civility, equal opportunity for all, acceptance of difference and of the foreigner, all of these problems that we face today were the very same problems that our ancestors faced 80 years ago. What few of us realize is just how fragile our freedom is. There actually was a brief moment in time in the early 1940s when the Allies stood on the brink of defeat and the very legacy of the Enlightenment would have been extinguished. It was the frightening prospect that this fragile legacy could be lost that gave me the fuel for writing both of my novels. So, in conclusion, the greatest generation was full of heroes whose courage and intestinal fortitude got America through the threat of the dystopian future of intolerance, racism, and autocracy that had been unleashed by Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. Everyday Americans who had never even heard of Immanuel Kant or Voltaire joined the fight and won. These perfectly ordinary people were forced to endure extraordinary challenges. But in the course of doing that, they found a way not merely to survive, but to maintain their humanity. And by doing that, they saved what is best and most laudable in Western civilization. That, in a nutshell, is what the characters of my novels want you to know. And now we'll have our questions and answers, but I would ask that you please jot down my email and website address in case you have a question and we run out of time, or if you later think of something you wish you'd ask, and I'll be happy to answer those questions. Also, on my website, I've got links to the maps of the battles in which the Rangers fought. And at that, I will turn it over to you, Mike. Do you want me to stop sharing the screen?
You can do that. Yep, that'll make you a little bit larger. And what I would do is ask you to send me your website address. I think I have it, so that I can put it on the video that we produce that let people share what you talked about today.
That sounds
great. In many respects, it was more of a philosophical discussion than it was a discussion about how you write fiction. But right now, I'd like to open it up to questions if anybody has questions. Quite often it takes a couple seconds.
Looks like we have 2 questions in the chat.
Let me just check the chat. No, the chat information was Steve said he promised that Hitler promised the 1st Battalion to reach the sea at Anzio would have the honor of extended leave and a parade in Berlin. But really, right now, it seems no questions. You seem to have covered the topic well. I would ask, how well have you used your books anywhere in lectures or talks to the public?
I have done, this is probably about my 10th book talk, Mike, I'd say. And I've always enjoyed it. Looks like Wendy Baker raised her hand there.
Where's Wendy? Whoops, wrong slide there. I don't see her hand raised here. Wendy, if you have a question, go ahead and use it. Put it either in chat or the question and answer icon. I guess not, Mike. Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I have really. I'm just so appreciative for this opportunity. This is such a august group that you have, Mike, and it was such an honor to have an opportunity to speak with you all.
Transitioning from novels into films, what's the so you look at Wind at Wars, back probably when we were both recently out of college, and then when they turned it into a movie, or even Tora. The translation of a well-written book into a film, as an author, what pitfalls do you see?
Well, I think the best way I could describe it is this: the difference between writing a novel and writing a screenplay is like the difference between engineering and physics. It certainly has a lot in common, but there definitely is a skill set that's required for writing a screenplay. And my wife is encouraging me to do that, by the way. But I've also got this 3rd novel that I really want to write, which is Can We Find Our Way Back Home?
But do a new James Garner movie, to look at Darby Raiders again. Hey, it hasn't been done in over 50 years. It's about time.
That's right. It's 1958.
if we could do a Star is Born every 10 to 15 years, we could do another Darby's Rangers.
Yeah, it would be interesting to know if you think that you're obviously much more familiar with this than I. Do you think that the Rangers were the most elite fighting force of World War II, the First Ranger Battalion?
In many ways, yes. They were not always used to the best of their capabilities. But even some of the airborne troops, early airborne troops, were very well trained. Some of the engineer units were pretty good.
Oh, yeah.
The specially trained engineer units. The question that all those units had was the ability to sustain that excellence once they entered into sustained combat. I mean,
Mike, there's two notes in the Q&A. I can't.
Oh, we did get some Q&As here. I gotta keep on switching glasses depending whether I'm looking at the screen or looking at notes. This is from David. His first question is, where do you put a fictional character in place of a historical character? We know that so many of the individual Rangers, and many of them came from the 34th Division, which was a National Guard division from Minnesota and Iowa.
Right.
So how do you figure out when to put a fictional character in?
Well, you just, in my mind, what you do is you take the basic facts and then you figure out how can you put a fictional character into these events so that everything that they do is completely plausible. One of the things that happened with the 34th was, I believe that included Southeast South Dakota, which is where this young man was from. And he was the one who ended up convincing Virgil to join to try out for the Rangers along with him. So it's those sorts of things. You go in and you look at I went in and looked at the ships that went across, which corps was it that went at what time, to make sure that Virgil was on a ship that would have arrived at the right time. So I tried to make sure that every single thing that Virgil was involved in was actually what happened. And I just inserted him like anybody else. There were a lot of people we don't know the names of who were there.
It is. There's a book written in the 70s called The Lionhead by Josiah Bunning. And he wrote a fictional account of the Riverine Force in Vietnam because he said, I was not witness to everything that I thought had happened.
Right.
So it's another thing. And then I got a comment by Rick, who said the 1st Infantry Division was able to sustain its excellence through rigorous training until the end of the war, despite heavy losses.
Yes.
Rick, I wonder if you were a member of the 1st Infantry Division at one time, because they're a very proud unit and they are an excellent unit. Then we have another one. So yeah, it takes some time sometimes, and they're coming in. This is from Wendy. First, I applaud your achievement in incorporating accurate, informative facts of World War II in an engaging fictional story. I'd also like to note for your audience that Oklahoma University was successful in making its academic presence, and which its football programs could be proud for all those years. OU had the highest number of National Merit Scholars of all public universities, and for at least 3 years, the highest number of National Merit Scholars in all public and private universities. I assume she is a Oklahoma University.
I think she is. I think she actually also went to Norman Hahn.
Okay.
She was behind me.
And then this is Rick. They got Greg Fontenot's upcoming book addresses this topic. I know Greg is, I don't know if you know Greg, he's a longtime military historian. Greg and I have worked together on pulling information from some of the veteran surveys to look at how one of the tank battalions maintained their high excellence during the war by being pulled back out of the line and retraining. So Rick, yes, I'll try to convince Greg to come back and talk about his book when he gets a chance to finish it. And then let's see. I don't know how much fictional accounts, but somebody asked, what do I think about Tim O'Brien? What do you think about Tim O'Brien's novels on Vietnam? Have you ever read any of those?
I've pretty much been sticking with World War II.
Okay.
So I would hate to say anything one way or another about O'Brien's work, although it's well known.
Okay. Well, I'm a
and well thought of.
colonialist. I'm a colonialist by training, so sometimes anything beyond 1814 is current events. And then Rick was a member who Greg Fontenot was his battalion commander. So I guess he's well aware of what Greg does. This is from Katie Clark. Thank you for your time this evening. I read leaving, and I'm going to mess up, Pontotoc County?
Pontotoc.
Pontotoc County. And it was an enjoyable and informative read. What are your thoughts regarding writing from an unbiased perspective regarding historical fiction? During my MA studies, it was heavily stressed to write objectively regarding non-fictional historical people, events, and eras. Do you feel that there's a growing challenge to write historical fiction while omitting personal bias?
Yeah, this is, you're going to inject yourself into it no matter what it is. I mean, this is, the Heisenberg principle, right? I mean, you're going to insert yourself into it in one way or another. But it does seem to me that fiction gives you a little more latitude that you don't have when you're writing nonfiction. And particularly, and at least obviously in my case, I have some things that are very important to me. I really feel very strongly about this whole trauma issue. And in fact, that's going to be a big part of what the Can We Find Our Way Back Home is going to be about, is that sense that they had. But how do you do that objectively? I don't know. That involves what's going on inside someone's head, a whole generation's head. And it's a hard thing to do, but I think it's a challenge, and I'm looking forward to it.
And to some extent, objectivity changes over time.
Yeah.
So
objectivity is a slippery slope.
Yes.
We have to try to be unbiased, but objective is a little tough.
Okay. Well, I think that concludes the questions. Now after that, any closing remarks?
No, other than I'm just so excited that I got to do this. Your group is so wonderful, Mike, and does so much for us, and we're so appreciative. And I am so grateful that you gave me this chance, and I so appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry it took a while to get you on the schedule, but I'm glad we have you. For those who did attend tonight, we will be posting this up on YouTube. So if you thought it was a good presentation, especially if a professor for some of your students, please let them know about it. We'll be sending out the links here in the next couple days. So please do promote this talk, because it was different from what we normally do. Next talk is on the 13th of July at 7 p.m. We're moving into Vietnam, and it's going to be Abandoned in Hell, the Fight for Vietnam's Fire-Based Cape with Bill Albrecht. Again, another Vietnam's talk, but again, one of those things that was important as we look at that war. So I look forward to seeing you on the 13th of July. Mike, thanks again, and look forward to talking to you in the future. If you get out this way, you're not that far. Come on up.
I'm planning on it.
Okay. Thanks. Good night.
Thank you.